Hello everybody! Today, magic. Again. I know I've made several videos on magic already, and by no means am I going to guarantee you that this will be the last one, but this one I think is indeed very important. In a lot of worlds, we don't really concern ourselves on how magic works, or even why it exists in this world in the first place. The majority of us simply acknowledge that magic is part of these fantasy worlds with no real answer, and then we just leave it at that. And it's a real shame because magic can be such a complex and interesting topic in your world and can lead to so many amazing adventures, depending on how the DM decides to run their game. And it's such a shame because the origins and way that magic works can lead to so many interesting stories in your universe, provided you have a DM that is willing to make some very interesting encounters. But without further ado, let's go over some examples on how magic works. To start, let's start with the standard D&D version, the Wizards of the Coast version of how magic works. And theirs is probably the most complicated system of magic. So, how does magic really work in the Wizards of the Coast system? Well, that depends on what kind of caster you are. Magic in that world comes from several different sources, generally from beings of higher power. Now, I'm not going to go into the specifics of how and where magic comes from in these worlds of Wizards of the Coast. All you really need to know is that usually magic comes from beyond our earthly plane, usually either from gods, from beings of incredible power or will, or simply from other dimensions entirely. To start with probably the most simple idea of where magic comes from, let's start with the cleric. In this case of clerics, the idea is that they are chosen by their god. A cleric will utter a prayer to their god, and in return, that god will provide them with that power, dependent on what the prayer is. Pretty simple. I provide prayers to my god provides me with spells to smite his enemies, or do great miracles in his name. And you might think that a paladin would have a very similar method of casting magic, but they actually have a lot more in common of all things sorcerers. Both paladins and sorcerers produce magic from their will. Now, in a paladin's case, it's usually derived from their faith in their god, their force of will. That's why it's charisma. It's them willing these miracles and smites into existence. In a sorcerer's case, yes, they are willing their magic into existence, no training required, but their power is not being drawn from their god or from their own will, but instead is being drawn from their ancestry, whether that be an ancient dragon, an old fae, or some arcane disaster that they came across years and years ago. A warlock? Well, we already know where the magic for those people come from. That comes from their deal they made with whatever deity or demon or devil or abyssal monstrosity decided to take note in them and, in exchange for your soul, give you awesome powers, such as Eldritch Blast. Which leaves us with the wizard. The wizard isn't innately powerful. They don't get their spells and power from gods or from will or any of that. Instead, they gain their power through knowledge. By understanding how the world works, how magic flows through their world, through arcane knowledge and tomes and glyphs, wizards are able to shape the world by understanding the nuances of magic. They understand that if I say these words with the right resonance, then the clockwork that runs this universe will allow me to alter it. Granted, I might have over-embellished that, but that's the general idea. That by understanding the world, and by understanding the cracks and the rifts and the flow of magic, you yourself can manipulate it. But of course, you'll need your spell tome to do that, because, well, you have to have notes for these sort of things, don't we? This is why you need keen mind to be a wizard. Druids, on the other hand, get their magic in a bit of a different way from wizards, though somewhat similar, less mechanical and more organic. By understanding nature itself, by observing nature, by living with nature, the druid becomes wiser to the way the world works. They begin to see the ebb and flow of how nature entwines with magic. Perhaps with a little help from druidic symbols and from their fellow druids and dryads and naiads and all those beautiful creatures from the Feywild, they learn to have nature work with them, to flow and ebb with their commands. That is how magic works in standard D&D, and as you can already tell, it's quite complicated. Each different caster has a different method of invoking their magic. Though, in all honesty, it usually comes from generally the same source. Either the magic is entwined in the world, or is given by a being of higher power. And that also somewhat derive into the sorcerer. The sorcerer is a bit of a wild card, along with the paladin who just wills their magic into existence. Are there any more? And to that, I say yes. Yes, there are many, 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 many more. And one of the best ones out there is Warhammer, both fantasy and 40k, where magic is less given to you and more part of the world itself. In Warhammer, there are two different planes of existence. There is the physical plane and the immaterial plane. As you can probably guess, the material plane is lovely. It's our world, full of deserts, murderers, hobos, and, unicorns. I don't know why I lumped that together, but it works. And on the other hand, in the Immaterium, we have really nothing. The Immaterium is made up of all of the thoughts, minds, and old souls that once resided in the material plane. Simple thoughts become energy and power. And those of us who have a strong enough will and are perhaps born slightly different are able to tap into that power on the other side of the veil and pull it through to our world to change it as we see fit. It can be something as simple as summoning a bolt of lightning to completely destroying an entire planet with a single snap of the fingers, Thanos style. 40k and Warhammer are not the only ones that have this sort of magical identity too. Dragon Age, to its own extent, has this idea with the Fade, two different planes, with spirits being on one end and mortals being on the other. Mortals being able to pull things through the Fade to cast their own forms of magic. And now the last form of magic that I'm going to mention here is actually a bit more steampunky, and of all things is seen in Valkyrie Chronicles. To an extent-ish, it's easier to explain that way than by looking back at Warhammer with Skaven, who used Warpstone, which is technically from the war. It's easier this way, just bear with me. Now, in this form of magic, usually the way things work is that by consuming different materials, or by possessing certain stones or energy sources, the user is able to tap into that ability. Think of it this way. You have a purple-colored Jawbreaker, which apparently gives you spellcasting abilities of shielding. With this system, it's a bit more reliant on materials and may not work best for your worlds, but it does provide a very interesting world to go around in. A world reliant on these magical crystals could very easily lead to some very, very interesting conflicts. Entire wars fought on behalf of recovering this magical material. Honestly, I think that's just an interesting idea. Okay, there is one more kind of magic which I meant to bring up, and that is the magic we see in Tales of Xillia, of all things. For those of you that haven't seen Tales of Xillia or any of the Tales series, let me explain their kind of magic real quickly, because I think it's actually really interesting too. In Tales of Xillia and all the other Tales series, the idea for magic with them is it's not so much magic, but being lent the powers of spirits. The way this works is that the spellcaster, let's say it's me, has an extra part of their brain, something called a mana lobe, which, well, mana, being essentially this excess soul or energy. The idea, then, is that the spellcaster will say a phrase, or, in their case, a contract. What is this contract exactly? I'm glad you asked. The contract is, in exchange for this much mana, you, spirit, will do this for me. And the idea is that the spirit will come into our plane of existence, do whatever is asked of it, and then in return will be allowed to take mana. It kind of reminds me of like a pet or something a little bit, and I kind of like that, because you get to imagine constantly making deals with different strange spirits and creatures from the Veil. These are all just different forms of ways you can make your magic work. Now, why is this important? Well, if we don't analyze how our magic works, we can't make conflicts around it. It's important to understand how the magic in your world works to make conflict. The more in-depth, more interesting, more complicated that magic system is, the more conflicts we can make around it, and make our worlds feel more alive and real. In Tales of Xillia, for example, one of the major problems in that world, eventually, is that people start killing off the spirits that they make the deals with to produce magic, and their entire world is based around magic. That leads to an incredible storyline. In Warhammer, warp storms in the Immaterium can affect reality, often causing demonic possessions and far, far worse. And this tale just goes on. Standard D&D doesn't really have the luxury of having those interesting stories. I mean, you can say that if a god is dead, a group of clerics can't cast spells, or that perhaps a bloodline of mages is now having trouble, but it doesn't feel as real, at least to me. It doesn't feel as grounded or as powerful as if I was in Tales of Xillia or in the Warhammer world. Anyway, this is just a quick little video on different kinds of methods of magic. I'll probably make another one following this up. Regardless, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to be seeing you in the next video. Have a good day.